Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Kulaga, Executive Creative Director for the New York Times live conversation series TimesTalks. We are thrilled to present tonight's TimesTalks Tech event in Washington, D.C. on cyberwarfare, one of the greatest threats to American democracy and commerce. Tonight's conversation is as timely as it is important, taking place during National Cybersecurity Awareness Month and 1 week before a consequential midterm election. I want to give special thanks to Deloitte, the sponsor of tonight's TimesTalks Tech event. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Nishita Henry, Chief Innovation Officer of Deloitte.
Thank you, Tom. Deloitte is very proud to be part of today's discussion. Today's ever-changing and exponential transformations are really shifting the nature of the need for cybersecurity. With the fourth industrial revolution, connected and smart everything will soon be ubiquitous. In fact, by 2020, it's expected that there'll be over 24 billion connected devices, over 4 per person on Earth. Given these changes, there is also exponential opportunity for bad actors to take advantage of not only devices, but technologies and platforms, with the potential for dire consequences. So we have an imperative to reinvent the role of the leading security executive to enable a competitive advantage and differentiator for our organizations and ourselves. So what does this all mean? What it really means is that we need to be at the table not just for design and implementation, but also for the conceptualization of the new products, services, and innovations as they're getting started. We need to be proactive versus reactive, focusing on value creation versus value protection as we enter the revolution of cyber-physical systems. This new age of cyber provides a unique opportunity for security leaders like yourselves to elevate and change the game. You can either be the passenger or you can be the leader. The choice is yours. So thank you so much for investing time with us tonight on this important topic. We look forward to a very dynamic dialogue. And so now back to Tom to introduce today's panel.
Thank you, Nishita, and now on to our program. We've assembled a world-class panel to assess the growing cyber threat to American democracy and business. Moderating tonight's event is David E. Sanger, New York Times national security correspondent and senior writer. During his 36-year reporting career at the Times, he's been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting, including How Russian Cyberpower Invaded the U.S. His newest book, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, explores how the rise of cyber weapons has transformed geopolitics like nothing since the invention of the atomic bomb. Now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to David and our panelists, John Demers, Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division, Yasmin Green, Director of Research and Development for Jigsaw, and Dmitri Alperovitch, co-founder of CrowdStrike.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming here tonight. We've got a remarkable panel for you, as you've heard. John here to my immediate left, your right, has been Assistant Attorney General for National Security Affairs since, I guess, about February or so. Is that right? He was a Boeing executive, but before that, he was back in the National Security Division in the Bush administration, and he taught law at Georgetown Law Center. He was a clerk for Justice Scalia. My great friend Yasmin Green is Director of Research and Development at Jigsaw, a unit of Alphabet. You guys do everything you can to avoid saying Google in the middle of all of these.
We can rely on you for that, though.
That's right. She is, I can tell you from years of reporting to this, simply one of the best minds on how to use technology to make the world safer. She's led projects in Iran, in Syria, in the UAE, in Nigeria. She's just back from Ukraine. We'll want to hear about that a little bit. She's interviewed ISIS defectors and recruits. She's a member of the Aspen Cyber Strategy Group. And my great friend Dmitri Alperovitch of CrowdStrike is the man who helped find the GRU lurking inside the DNC Networks, that was an exciting month. Dmitri, we were on the phone a lot. He was born in Russia, moved to Canada and then the US. It's a remarkable life story that I tell a little bit about in The Perfect Weapon. He investigated Operation Aurora, which was a Chinese attack on Google and others. He named Shady Rat, we can talk about that later on, the major cyber espionage case. Cyber has become the weapon of choice for large nations and small, and the primary way in which they compete and undercut each other in short-of-war operations. People throw around the phrase cyber war a lot, and I understand why we use that, but the fact of the matter is we're in a sort of constant, so far, relatively low-level perpetual conflict. But there is no assurance that it's going to stay at that low level. I frequently say to people, I sort of feel like we're where the world was at the end of World War I, where we had used airplanes, but we didn't really fully understand their capacity to deliver incredibly powerful weapons, and ultimately in 1945, the most powerful weapon. And since we're just 2 weeks out from the 100th anniversary, it's sort of a sobering thought about where it is that we are in this technology. This comes in many forms: espionage, data manipulation, what we're all concerned about in the coming election and the election after that. We'll talk about that. But not just data manipulation in elections. If somebody stepped in and changed all the blood types in military database, you can imagine the damage, or in a financial database. Destruction of physical infrastructure, similar to the attacks that North Korea did against Sony, the United States and Israel did against Iran's nuclear plants and North Korea's missiles. The list goes on, and it's gotten increasingly long. And then, of course, information operations. So we're going to try in our 60 minutes here to give a sense of those and turn to you for some of your questions. John, I wanted to start with you with a little bit of news. A few hours before you came over here, you issued another indictment of Chinese intelligence officers. I think this is the third one in 2 months.
In 2 months, yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Why are we seeing this sudden burst of indictment activity against the Chinese? Because many of these are for events that took place even before President Obama and Xi Jinping reached their agreement. And how effective do you think these indictments are?
So thanks, David, and thanks for having me here today. I think, you know, as you said, these cases have been, and investigations have been going on for quite some time. So the time when they're indicted is, you know, really the conclusion of an investigation, and the confidence that we have that if we had to, and sometimes we do, as in the case a couple of weeks ago where we actually extradited a Chinese intelligence officer from Belgium, that we'll be able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt in court, right? So that's basically the, you know, what drives the timing of the indictments. There is a lot of Chinese activity focused on stealing American and other nations, but American is our focus, intellectual property. So it's fertile ground to till when it comes to these indictments and to this kind of activity. You know, we're very focused on it right now. I have to say my predecessors in the National Security Division in 2014 were the first folks to bring an indictment, and that was a big deal. I think you've written about it and talked about it. I mean, that was a huge deal to be able to get over the hurdle of, are we actually going to charge intelligence officers of a foreign country for the activity that they're doing, the cyber activity that they're doing? Having overcome that hurdle, I think each successive indictment is easier. You're not constantly having that policy debate. You know, it's now accepted that this is, you know, a tool that we can use to counter this kind of behavior.
When I talk to people in the intelligence agencies, the American intelligence agencies, about this, on the one hand, they applaud you for doing it, and they're glad that the evidence that you put in is gathered from outside intelligence channels so you can introduce it in court. Some of it's been very detailed. On the other hand, they're a little nervous about this because the U.S. conducts cyber operations as well, and they're concerned that other countries will begin indicting American intelligence officers for things that we consider to be well-vetted and legal operations.
So I think, especially on the Chinese side, the line, we have those conversations for sure, but the line that we've drawn, and if you look at today's indictment, if you look at last week's indictment, if you look at the indictment before that, et cetera, all the way back to 2014, is we don't steal other countries' intellectual property and hand it over to our companies so that they can compete more effectively against their international competitors. So that's, and a lot of these indictments are really focused on that kind of behavior. So now when we go beyond that, you're right, the conversations with the intelligence community get more complicated.
I'm sure they do. Dmitri, you started your career chasing down Chinese intellectual property theft, Unit 61398, which I think is what you called later Shady Rat and APT-1. This was a PLA unit. What John is indicting are actually intelligence officers. There's been a shift. Describe this to us.
Absolutely. Thank you, New York Times. Thank you, George Washington University, for having me. I actually started my career way earlier chasing criminal groups before I got into nation states. But yeah, it's been interesting to watch the shift in Chinese behavior. For the last 15 years, they've been on this massive offensive to steal intellectual property from pretty much every company that they have any moderate interest in, whether from an IP perspective, negotiation strategy, pricing, all sorts of interesting stuff. For the most part, it has been the PLA that have been doing a lot of this activity, not exclusively, but the majority of it have been various units within the People's Liberation Army, what used to be called the 3rd Department of General Staff, which was responsible for cyber operations. Starting with 2015 and the changes that President Xi had introduced in China, there was a massive reorganization of the PLA. They stood up an actual cyber force, their own kind of equivalent to Cyber Command. But also at the same time, we started to see a shift more towards operations being conducted by the Ministry of State Security, which is their civilian intelligence arm, and the two individuals indicted were part of MSS. They're a much more professional cyber force in our estimations at CrowdStrike. We have seen them over the years break into organizations that were always better technically than the PLA. And I think it's understandable when you think about any military organization. You may have people that are going to the service. You're a recruit, 18-year-old, you're given a 6-month crash course in cyber, and now you're a cyber operator, and 4 years later, you're out of the service and you're doing something else, or even sooner, you maybe move to another unit and become an artilleryman. This happens in the US, this happens all over the world. When you're in the intelligence service, you're doing your job, and you may be doing that for 20 years, and that gives you a chance to improve your skill sets, learn from your mistakes, and get much better. So traditionally, and this is not exclusive to China, we've seen much greater capabilities out of intelligence services than out of military services in the cyber domain. This is also true for Russia, by the way. In the last really year and a half, as we started to see a big pickup of Chinese intrusion activity since the agreement in 2015 kind of started to fall apart in our estimation. Because in 2015, the Obama administration did achieve an agreement with President Xi that both countries will not conduct economic espionage against each other. Of course, that was an easy give for the US, given that we already had a policy not to do it, but it was a very important concession to get out of China. And not immediately, but shortly afterwards, we saw a dramatic reduction in Chinese intrusions against the commercial sector. Not necessarily everywhere, because national security espionage was still permitted under the agreement. And that continued for about a year, and then we started to see slow resumption. And then at this point, I can confidently say they're back, and we're seeing on a weekly basis intrusions into US and other Western companies from Chinese actors, primarily from the Ministry of State Security, where they're breaking into organizations that really have no dual purpose whatsoever, right? These are not military defense contractors. These are not national security establishments. This is biotech. This is high-tech technology, professional services, law firms, all kinds of organizations that clearly have intellectual property that would be useful for commercial gain.
Yasmin, if we were having this discussion 3 or 4 years ago, this would have dominated the rest of the evening because intellectual property theft, espionage was the main thing that we'd seen, apart from the US and some other operations against physical infrastructure. And then 2 years ago, right around now, the world began to discover what you've been working on for so many years, which is how influence operations take advantage of social media. So we're 1 week out exactly from Election Day. You've been watching this more carefully than anybody. Give us the lay of the land of what we're seeing and what we're not seeing compared to 2016.
Right. So, so in terms of information operations, which is the threat that my group, Jigsaw, has spent a lot of time trying to understand and track, I think of the espionage, whether it be for IP purposes or national security purposes, as using the suite of tools as that we've come to know of as kind of traditional cyber hacking, like malware and phishing and trying to infiltrate computers and systems, and it's different to the type of threat that we've been tracking, which is really not about hacking into networks. It's about hacking into the conversation and hacking into our minds, actually. So we were pretty early to identify the activity of the Internet Research Agency, which was the Russian-affiliated group who were basically meddling in the 2016 election. Actually, who were meddling in a lot of activity around the world, but the topic that's kind of consuming us in the US was the 2016 election meddling. And our research kind of enabled all the platforms to suspend the activity. So what we've seen over the last year has been, I would say that the indictments, and the efforts by governments and law enforcement to name and shame and prosecute the activity, as well as the efforts by the platforms to suspend the networks, haven't deterred the actors. Neither Russia, who continue to persist in terms of their efforts to influence online conversations in this country and elsewhere, and also in terms of incentivizing new players in this space. So in August, we worked with FireEye, another cybersecurity analysis firm, to identify activity from Iran. Really ambitious influence operations that were targeting conversations across 4 different continents and across the internet, so YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit. So we're seeing not only was Russia not deterred, even though they've been the subject of so much public attention and attempts to penalize them, but also we're seeing other actors use the same playbook that Russia kind of advertised for others. Some of the tactics have changed. They're a little bit smarter. They use local currency instead of, they don't use rubles, they use US dollars, or they make an effort to hide, mask the country of origin using things like VPNs. But pretty much, actually, it's the same playbook. There's a risk there's a risk that we're looking to protect the 2018 elections or even the 2020 elections, really looking back at a threat that we haven't learned a lot about since 2016. So we saw the Iranians use similar operational tradecraft to the Russians, front organizations often posing as news outlets, as activist organizations, social media personas that are kind of shaped in the image of local constituents and trying to amplify messages and really trying to seed influence and participate in conversations that are locally relevant. Even though I'd say the tactics of the Iranians and the Russians were the same, the agenda was quite different, or the substance was quite different. So in the case of the Russians, they famously were on every side of every issue. They had fake accounts that had influence, so had followers and had traction, that were pro-gun and anti-gun, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, liberal, Democrats and Republicans. The Iranians weren't so even in their efforts. They definitely were pushing conversations that were trying to advance the Iranian political agenda, so anti-Israel, anti-Saudi, promoting the Shia cause in Bahrain. They also had a strong preference for liberal candidates, much more for the Democrats than the Republicans. Also, the Labour
So they're working
Party.
at counter purposes. If you believe that the Russians, at the end of 2018, as the intelligence reports indicated, the U.S. intelligence report said they came in at the end in favor of then candidate Trump.
End of 2016.
Right, in 2016, I'm sorry. In 2018, we're seeing the Iranians actually in a little bit of an anti-Trump run.
Yeah, not just a little bit. Yep, they have their own. They don't like that the nuclear deal, has basically been jeopardized and is coming to an end. They're not only anti this administration and anti-Republican, they're also pro-liberal and pro-Muslim candidates. So where they've expressed, where there have been races where there have been Muslim candidates running, they've been on their side. So what does that tell us? The information operations threat continues. I think we're seeing more attention and more success in terms of highlighting and prosecuting the activity both from government and the tech sector, but it seems that it's just too tempting a threat vector. So we're not going to see a cessation, I don't believe.
John, when you look at the volume of activity, so Yasmin's told us it's still going on, but what we're hearing in the private sector is it's not going on at the level at which it was going on in 2016. Is that consistent with what all of you are seeing? And if so, why may that be? Is this sort of a practice session at this point, waiting for 2020? Is it just harder to mess around with midterm elections than with presidential elections, where there's a single candidate and sort of easier to get organized? What's your best theory of the case?
Yeah, I don't know why that would be. We have seen, what we've said publicly is, look, we continue to see the kind of activity that Yasmin described, for sure. We have seen the spread, in terms of the Iranian use of these same tactics. We have not seen the attacks on election infrastructure, so on voter registration databases or on voting databases.
Both of which we did see months before the 2016 election.
Voter registration databases, right, for sure. Mm-hmm. Right. So there is a change. It may be, what you said, that it's a little harder to focus your efforts when you have such a diffuse set of candidates running across the entire country. On the other hand, there's only going to be a handful of races that matter, right? So just like any of the political parties, they focus their efforts on where they think they can really affect the outcome. You could see a country doing that, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Dmitri, does any of this make you feel better? I mean, you and I have always said you'd never run the same playbook.
That's right.
Again.
We're a week away, but we're a week away, right? There is still time, and I think that we should not be complacent, and in particular, we should not look at 2016 and assume that whatever we'll see going forward, either in this year or in 2020, will look exactly the same, because one thing is almost certain, it likely won't be. There is still plenty of opportunity for a variety of threat actors, including Russia, to mess with us. I think that we need to remain vigilant, and I'll certainly sleep better at night the day after the election, but not a moment sooner.
Mm-hmm. So, Yasmin, pick up on this theme a bit, because certainly in the social media space, we've seen the attackers go way up the learning curve. They've hidden themselves much better. Facebook's initial assessments in 2016, after the election, were pretty dismissive of anything having happened. By the time they got in front of Congress, they were admitting that their radar was basically off the entire time. So tell us what it is about social media that makes it so difficult to detect, and how much better is our detection capability now than it was 24 months ago?
Yeah, I think one of the big differences between information operations, hacking the conversation versus hacking systems is that with the latter, there are tactics that we categorically view as bad and malicious. So malware is bad. If you're putting software on someone's computer without them knowing it, it's bad. It doesn't matter who the actor is.
Also illegal.
Also illegal, that's what's helpful. Yeah, denial of service attacks. When you spam a website with so much traffic that you take it down, that's bad. It doesn't matter who that actor is. Phishing is bad when you're taking somebody's personal details from them without, under false pretenses. So when we have a tactic that we can put in the bad category, we can develop a system to identify the tactic, and then we can detect it and deter that type of malicious activity. That's the space where I think that the tech platforms feel the most comfortable. The thing with the social media stuff is that it's actor specific. The activity itself doesn't violate terms of service, actually until, let me talk about that because I think the companies, the platform's policies were revised to reflect the changing threat. But at the time of the 2016 election, they didn't necessarily violate terms of service. They weren't illegal. These guys, and this is about much more than the Internet Research Agency. This goes for terrorist groups, the Islamic State. A lot of these malicious actors are using social media in exactly the way that it was designed to be used. So in the case of the Internet Research Agency, uploading videos about featuring police officers and communities of color, people of color being brutalized like that. If that had been uploaded by an American citizen, there would be no issue. So then you get into some really tricky territory. You either say we're going to look to identify all activity on all the platforms, and when we know that it's a state actor, we're going to prosecute it, which is largely what's happening, but it's difficult to scale that. And then when you have new actors and you don't have any idea what infrastructure they use or what their tradecraft is, you're stuck. Or you try to learn what the markers of coordinated, of disinformation or social media manipulation are that could help you detect it. So one of the insights that we've had is that coordinated online activity. We're not talking about just ad hoc people, from the Russian government independently uploading content pretending to be Americans. Actually, there are, agencies. There are the so-called troll farms, but there are organizations of people who have instructions. In our office in New York, we have a troll farm manual. It's pretty much what you would expect it to be. It has the talking points this one was to target, it was for a domestic audience. So it had all the things that the Russian government cares about, propagating domestically. For example, messages about the ruble, about NATO, about opposition leaders, Boris Nemtsov. And many people, hundreds of people, are tasked with propagating the messages for the day publicly. So that's kind of helpful, actually. The fact that it's not an individual, that it is a group who are given marching orders, means that we have coordinated activity, when it's malicious, and ad hoc activity when it's organic. So some of the progress I think that's been made is with that insight is to say, well, coordinated activity has specific markers. For example, temporally, people in a troll farm work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Moscow time. That's not consistent with a mother of two in Arizona who they're pretending to be. They don't work on Russian weekends. They don't work on Russian national holidays.
Until they implement the night shift.
Until they do.
I guess nobody wants to pay overtime anymore. Is that it?
Even that there would be a delay in responding to a real-world event if you need to get your instructions from up on top. So we've seen that in the case of the Syrian Electronic Army, where we've seen accounts respond, but after a couple of hours, when organic accounts obviously, firstly are more dispersed and also respond immediately. So there are temporal markers, there are relational markers, how the accounts follow each other, and potentially also semantic markers. So if you have a hymn sheet that you're reading from, even if you're you're allowed to use your own words, you're probably going to be expressing yourself in a similar way to other accounts that are responding to the same set of instructions.
You now know why Yasmin's office in New York is so cool, because it's in a building that used to track ships, and now it tracks troll farms. Yeah. John, help us through thinking about the legal implications of this some, because as Yasmin's pointed out, if any of the four of us posted some of these ads ourselves, the Texas secession ads that you've seen, or Black Lives Matters ads, or any of these others, it would fall completely within a free speech capability. And if you have an individual Russian, as Yasmin was saying, doing this on his own or her own in Moscow, you don't have an issue. So legally, how do you sort of put this together to say that an organization becomes a completely different problem when it's trying to influence our elections? And how would that differ from what Voice of America has done for years around the world?
Well, I guess I don't know that an individual Russian in Moscow wouldn't have First Amendment rights. Right.
No,
so if they were
you wouldn't go off on a prosecution if somebody issued an ad, it was their opinion.
Right. I mean, well, it probably wouldn't, because we wouldn't think they were enough of a threat.
Yeah.
But you could under the First Amendment, I guess, is all I'm saying there. With respect to the GRU or to the Internet Research Agency, I mean, you're right. So we have to be very careful, in investigating these cases, because the activity is not inherently unlawful, and in fact, done by Americans or folks in the U.S., it's protected by the First Amendment. But what we're always looking for are the markers that Yasmin went through to, back to organized, state-sponsored, for sure state-inspired activity back in Moscow or back in another country. At that point, we really don't have any First Amendment problems, but we have to be careful to focus our investigations and our indictments on those activities. That's what makes it very difficult, though, to say how, it's going to be almost impossible to truly stomp this out, right? Because it's so easy to do that kind of work. It's so easy to start up new accounts that I think what makes me, when you asked Dmitri, do you feel any better? I mean, what makes me feel better isn't the idea that, oh, well, as I was asked once, well, what quarter of the football game are we in? It's like, well, this is like a game without end. So it's like, what quarter of the football game are we in and stomping out crime once and for all in the United States? I mean, we're never going to get there, but we have to continue to make an effort. And what makes me feel better is that we're having this conversation. Because this is not, I mean, maybe, Yasmin, you guys were working on this 3 years ago, right? But the rest of us weren't, and we weren't having this conversation. And the problem with that is we didn't have the awareness, right? And so a lot of what we're trying to build in the indictments and otherwise is, that kind of knowledge and awareness, so that when the American people are on the receiving end of these ads or of these statements, et cetera, they can be more critical. They have the tools to be more critical about who might the speaker be.
But if I can just add, the key thing to realize about all this social media activity is that governments around the world, and not just the ones that we always talk about, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but many of our allies are looking at this medium and realizing that this is the new age, whereas previously they would hire PR firms and lobbying firms and buy TV ads to promote their agendas and to promote their image in the United States. Now they're realizing they can do that on social media, sometimes by hiding who they truly are, sometimes using their own citizens. So if you look at the case of the Washington Post journalist who was killed in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, you had lots of people going on Twitter and other social media sites and basically trying to discredit the narrative that Saudi Arabia had anything to do with it. It looked extremely organized, but they weren't pretending not to be Saudis. They were very clearly saying that that's who they were. Whether the government was inspiring that or not, or they were just patriotic, is a good question. But the reality is that the governments are realizing that this is a strategic medium for them to participate in a wide variety of fashion. And it may be related to elections, it may not be related to elections, but the idea that they will stop doing this, I think, is just not going to happen.
But Dmitri, you know, when you talk to Americans about cyber in the years before the 2016 election, they were thinking about manipulating the grid and so forth. Information warfare was sort of considered to be something different. When you talk to Russians, I shouldn't say this to you since you were, all right, it was all part of the spectrum. And so are we beginning to think about the problem more the way the Russians have thought about the problem for years?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. And this is something that I think we fundamentally misunderstood as a country. And you know, the First Amendment makes it very difficult for us to really participate in information warfare without you know, trying to influence our own population and having that blowback. But the reality is that going back to the original cyber doctrine that the Russian government put out back in 2000, just a few months after Putin was inaugurated for the first time as president of the Russian Federation, it wasn't called the cyber doctrine, it was called information doctrine. And in that original document, they talked about, it was all about how to protect Russia from cyber attacks, but they talked about defining cyber attack as a blog post out on the internet that is critical of the Russian government, that is accessible to the Russian population. And the US government laughed at that and said, what are you talking about? That's not a cyber attack. We're not taking down the grid. This is an expression of free speech. And unfortunately, the Russians had the last laugh.
Yeah. So, Yasmin, as I mentioned earlier, you were recently in Ukraine. And I have to say that as I was researching my book, Ukraine was probably the most fascinating single country that I visited doing this, because it's Putin's petri dish, right? It's where he experiments with every single thing that we've seen used here. It's just we weren't looking at what he was doing in Ukraine that carefully. We sent experts over to look when they turned off the power grid, but we never sent anybody over to go take a look at what they did during the elections or at the social media campaign. You spent some time looking at how the cyber war meets the physical war in the Donbass and in the East. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we were, after kind of tracking the 2018 midterms and not seeing a terrible amount that was new, we asked whether we would learn more about, for example, what's to come in 2020 in the US by looking at 2019 in the Ukraine. And that's because Ukraine has both presidential elections coming up in March and parliamentary elections coming up later in the year. And of course, they've always been on the front lines. You know, they're a close neighbor. They're a context in which Russia acts with impunity. And I remember one of my meetings there with President Poroshenko, you know, it presented this framing of Ukraine is on the front lines. If we want to learn anything, if we want to protect Ukraine and protect the US and Europe, we need to understand what's happening in Ukraine. He was, you know, definitely resonating, and he was like nodding emphatically. And then he told the story of, you know, the famous cyber attack, NotPetya. And he said, you know, NotPetya, which was, you know, it was ransomware that ended up taking out a whole part of the world, but really it was a state-sponsored attack from Russia on Ukraine. And he said, Petya, you know, is the pet name is like the nickname for Peter, which is his name, Petro Poroshenko. So he thinks this is personal. Like you know, for him, cyber attacks are something that Putin's doing intentionally to aggravate him.
Not to burst his balloon, though, the Russians did not name the attack NotPetya. Cybersecurity firms named it NotPetya because there was an original criminal-motivated ransomware that was called Petya. And the code of this latest attack by the Russians was based in part on the Petya code, but we had to differentiate it and we had to call it something else so that someone came up with the name NotPetya.
I won't tell him that. I think that's the version of the cyber story that he can tell. But yeah, there were some interesting takeaways for us from that trip. So on the election infrastructure side, I think there's less that's transferable. They're not, you know, they don't have states that make independent decisions about hardware and systems, and you know, they don't have that fragmentation, and they're not as digitized. So in the same way as the big attack on the electricity grid in 2015 that you describe in your book. So, you know, entertainingly, they went, you know, the way that they recovered from that attack wasn't through online systems, it was through going and physically turning back on the switches that had been turned off. It was a very manual recovery process. They have paper ballots, you know, in a way, they have some strengths and advantages versus that
we don't.
Yeah, the US and the EU.
We've taken all those big physical switches out of our electric grid, and we don't use that many paper ballots. Sometimes it's backup. But
I mean, we were just talking about this, but it's just made news that in Texas, the electronic voting machines have had a bug that changes people's votes, which hopefully they'll rectify in time for the midterms. But in any case, in terms of the kind of traditional cyber hacking, the hard cyber side, I think there's probably less vulnerable and there's less that's transferable. They'll definitely get attacked, but I think there are less learnings for us. On the info-op side, there was a lot to take away. So one of our insights was, because Russia's so insightful and so active in the Ukrainian landscape, we got to understand what the disinformation war looks like on several different fronts. First was the domestic front, so they have elections coming up. That's something that we're all consumed with here in the US, and we understood that pretty well. The second was in the conflict region. So we spent some time in Donbass, which is on the front lines of the fighting between Ukraine and Russia. There are separatist regions that Russia cares a lot about influencing. And there, the goal of disinformation it's the military's first strike. So they go with with an information operation campaign to prepare communities in separatist regions who they want to remain, they want these people to look to Russia for economic and cultural ties, not look to the EU, and not even look to Kiev. So before an attack, they'll disseminate a message, for example, attributing the attack a priori to the Ukrainians, even though it's coming from Russia. They do a lot to perpetuate an image of the Ukrainian army as being immoral. So there's a famous disinformation campaign around the Ukrainians crucifying a young boy. They put out a video, and it got a lot of traction. A lot of people in the region believe that the Ukrainian army did that. And they encouraged defections. So when Russian-backed forces went in, originally a lot of the Ukrainian police defected immediately because of disinformation campaigns. So the first is the domestic context. The second is the conflict context, and the third is the international context. So Euromaidan was triggered over Ukraine's allegiance to the EU, which Russia felt was a threat, and Russia's been invested heavily in disinformation in order to degrade Ukraine's relationship with its allies. It can't orient towards the EU or join the EU if the members of the EU don't want it. Poland has been a long-time ally. Russian disinformation narratives are kind of stoking up tensions relating to World War II atrocities involving the Ukrainians, and many polls claiming that ISIS fighters are coming from Poland and places like Romania into Ukraine. So, and really the relationship between Poland and Ukraine has deteriorated over the last few years. So one insight is we should expect different goals and strategies around disinformation depending on whether the context is domestic conflict or targeting allies. The second area that we were interested in inquiring about was the use of synthetic media. So a lot of there have been visual assets in terms of memes, but a lot of the kind of fake news and disinformation that we have thought about in the last couple of years have been news sites and posts. But we wanted to know whether we were seeing altered images and fake video as part of disinformation campaigns. And what we learned was that there are definitely fake images and fake videos and fake audio. So one example is President Poroshenko actually shared this, that there was a spoofed call where his voice was impersonated in a call to the NATO Secretary General. That was manual. There was also fake videos of political candidates, former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. They weren't taking advantage of kind of the state of the art in terms of AI-generated fakes, but they definitely demonstrated that there's so
they're moving toward the era of deep fakes. Yeah.
Right. As soon as the technology gets better and more widely distributed, we'll see that for sure, and I'm sure we'll see it in Ukraine first.
John, think about the future with us a little bit on this. I mean, you spend years building the kind of case that you brought out today. Yasmin just described a world in which you're going to have deep fakes where it will be much easier to hide who actually did these things, but also it will be much easier to hide the true meaning of the content of the message. How ready are we for this, not only within the Justice Department? I know your boss, Rod Rosenstein, gave a talk over the summer about what you're building up, but as you look at what you need to do and then what the rest of the U.S. government needs to do to both combat and deter this, are we playing at the level that you've just heard Yasmin describe?
Well, we're a lot readier than we were. I think, you know, in thinking about, I mean, certainly sort of these manufactured images, voices, videos, et cetera, are the next front in this battle. And one of the things I think that the Deputy Attorney General talked about at Aspen, and that we've been thinking through and actually have, you know, written out as a policy in our cyber report is, you know, we probably have to get a little more comfortable talking about what we see, not only through indictments. Now, maybe that's not for the Justice Department, you know, ultimately to say. That could be the intelligence community, that could be the FBI, that could be some other means. But, you know, at the Justice Department, we really speak through our indictments, right? We don't really go out there and issue a report or, you know, I mean, that happens sometimes.
The administration never reported that it was Russia that went into the State Department, the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They did report on North Korea, but in some of the Iranian cases. So what you're saying is, even if it's not an indictment, we need to be able to step out and call out countries.
We have to think more critically, I think, about when we're going to either let the victims know, which we have done more traditionally, but when are we going to talk to the public about what we're seeing? Because, and this is difficult, because attribution is difficult, and so, you know, before the U.S. government would say anything and attribute a specific activity to a specific actor, you know, we're going to have to have a high level of confidence when we see that, and that's really, honestly, where, you know, having the work of the private sector is so great, because I think that there are ways in which the private sector can speak that we're a little bit more hampered about speaking. But overall, we're going to have to get a little better about explaining to the American public about what we're seeing.
But I do have to say that there's been a sea change in this administration that's been really great to see, which is making attribution routine, not just through indictments, but you know, on that Petya, for example, attack, the White House came out with a statement saying this is Russian state-sponsored and got the allies on board. So
and the WannaCry,
the WannaCry to North Korea, yeah. And the fact that we haven't mentioned this, but the Justice Department over the last 2 years has indicted every major threat actor that we have: North Koreans, Iranians, Chinese, and the Russians. And I think that's a very welcome shift from really a number of previous administrations that never really talked publicly about attribution, except in a few cases. The fact that every single time there is a major event, very quickly we're now seeing the U.S. government broadly and Justice Department in particular coming out and doing this, I think, is a huge sea change that's very welcome.
Well, I'll have one more question for Dmitri on this, but we're going to open this up to questions in just a moment. And there's a microphone right in the central area, so if you have some, do step in front of the mic, and we'll call on you in just a minute. Dmitri, we're getting better at talking about who's attacking us. We haven't gotten significantly better about talking about our own capabilities or U.S. offensive activities. In other words, we talk more in the Cold War about our nuclear capabilities than we talk about our cyber capabilities today. Is that going to change? Should it change?
Maybe there's not much to talk about. So I think that, you know, look, when you look at the U.S. capabilities and our Five Eyes allies broadly, they are the best of the best technically. I would say they're probably extremely constrained in terms of policy. So we don't engage in the types of things that the Chinese engage in terms of IP theft. We don't engage in information operations to influence elections like the Russians and others do. So you know, we pursue very limited objectives in cyber. They're sort of traditional national security objectives. And you know, the attacks technically may be very, very cool. I'm not sure that you know, in the broad strategic sense that they're all that amazing from a effects perspective, because frankly, our adversaries are a lot more free in engaging in this type of activity. They don't have 50 lawyers, no offense to lawyers, checking and approving every step of the operation, and they're much more willing to take risks than we are.
That's right. With no beating up on lawyers at all, when we went through the Stuxnet code, one of the reasons it was clear it was done by a state was it had little expiration dates in it when the code would go, would basically be inert. It was sort of the way landmines are designed to turn off after a couple of years. And I remember sitting there thinking,
we've never seen that in the Russian code.
Yeah, Russians and teenagers do not put expiration dates in their malware. Okay, so first question right there, sir.
Hi. Thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. My name is Nagesh Rao. I'm the Director of Business Technology Solutions for the U.S. Small Business Administration and our Chief Information Officer office. So this is really fascinating because as one of the premier federal agencies for small businesses, we get hit with maybe 10,000 attacks, on a day, whereas DoD gets hit with like 1 million a day. So it's a little different, but I mean, at the same time, we're all facing these resource constraints on trying to up our game in the cybersecurity perspective. And actually, the IP thing was also interesting because I used to practice IP law. So it was just that nice confluence. So over the weekend, Mikey Dickerson, those who don't know, he was the head of the U.S. Digital Services in the previous administration. He put out a tweet out saying, regarding this issue of radicalization and the ownership that Facebook, YouTube, Twitter had on this effort, and he actually made in a statement saying that, they knew this. I was sent by the administration to go talk to them about this issue, and they didn't care. It was a pretty emphatic. If you look it up, he tweeted this out, and I was kind of taken aback by it when I saw that. And me and colleagues, we started discussing, where does the accountability happen? Where does the ownership happen on these issues? And you kind of hit it a little bit early on with the issue because of the First Amendment. Right, so we're trying to, as a democracy, keep that First Amendment, protected. But at the same time, you've got these actors now coming in and using misinformation as a presence through the social media.
Yasmin, you talked a lot about the foreign actors we've seen, but of course, in the past few days, we've been spending a lot of time on domestic hate speech, right? What we've seen about Jews since the killings in Pittsburgh, what we saw coming out around the time the bomber was being hunted down, alleged bomber. Tell us how this gets more complicated when you're dealing domestically.
Yeah, thank you for raising it. I think the events of the last week are so harrowing and saddening, and it is appropriate for us to talk about them today because cyber is not just a threat in the hands of state actors. There are non-state actors too that are. The Islamic State is a group that I've spent a lot of time studying, and as David said, I went to Iraq just to interview defectors, and I've spoken to lots of supporters, former supporters, men and women, young girls, a girl as young as 13 who tried to join, really trying to understand, what drives people to be radicalized, and also the role of technology within that. I think there's something significant that happened in terms of our collective ability and willingness to respond to violent extremism and radicalization in the context of violent Islamism. Because until 2013-14, the attitude definitely within the tech sector was, more speech, good speech will counter bad speech, and in particular, there are 1 billion plus Muslims around the world. Who are we to say when, what the line is beyond which, people shouldn't cross? And it was a really uncomfortable notion for the platforms that they might be trying to police speech among Muslims about topics, for example, of like Sharia. And then ISIS took Mosul and then branded themselves ISIS. And it's perverse to call it a silver lining, but one of the consequences of ISIS, the ISIS brand and the ISIS phenomenon was now you had a group that was clearly, it was on the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. It was recognized as a terrorist group. It was illegal. It was violent. And this was where so much of the attention of people who, had sympathies towards militant Islam, this is where, they were affiliating. So it actually catalyzed a massive response on the part of the tech sector to proactively design policies and design systems to identify that content and take it offline. I feel like where we are with the violent far right is kind of where we were with ISIS 4 years ago, which is, well, there are a lot of people that have, extreme right views, and it's very difficult to map out now, like, what the line is that people shouldn't cross. We could say the violent far right, but the tip of the spear is only the tip of the spear. There are many people who could be violent who don't fetishize swastikas and neo-Nazi ideology, but they're not as centralized. They don't have there's no U.S. government, prescribed list for the violent far right or white supremacists. So it makes it very challenging for us to go after them. The last thing I want is for everyone to unite behind a violent far right brand, but I really see a parallel in terms of where we are today in our struggle to fight the the ideologies and thinking that led to, for example, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting.
Well, we have a little less than 10 minutes. I want to make sure we get as many of the questions as we can. So if we ask you all to just do short questions, and we'll do our best to give you short answers.
Hi, my name is Howard Carlin. I'm a concerned citizen, and as a citizen, I've been involved with election protection. And my question is primarily for John. I'm glad to see that the Justice Department is taking action, and also the special prosecutor, in indicting these state actors. But at the same time, the White House abolished, did they not, the Office of Cyber Chief on the National Security Council. So are you concerned that they are not as concerned and focused, perhaps, as you are? And how do you address that? How do you work when the executive branch is really not convinced? I mean, I don't agree with the two gentlemen who said they're kind of seeing optimism now, that the White House is saying that that's just from public pressure.
Okay.
So I'd like to know your view. So
the elimination of the cyber coordinator, has it made a difference to you?
I mean, I don't think it's made too much of a difference day to day. I mean, the roles and responsibilities were taken on by other folks there. I mean, look, we are the executive branch, so we are very focused on this issue. The FBI is very focused on this issue. They have a whole foreign influence task force that is focused on this issue, working very closely with the private sector, providing information to the private sector so the private sector can then decide, based on their terms of use, what to do with it. I know that DHS has been out there working really hard with the state and locals on the election infrastructure issues and the resiliency issues, trying to get the states to at least have paper ballot backup systems. And in all states, we're not there yet, but that's the focus. So I don't, my job's not made harder by anything I've seen in the interagency. Actually, I've seen a lot of concern both on the intelligence community side at DHS and elsewhere, and focused on this issue.
Thank you.
Okay. Sir.
Good evening. David Ensor. I run something called the Project for Media and National Security here at George Washington University's Media School, which is upstairs. Yasmin, I'd like to ask you about the social media companies. And of course, yours has YouTube and other aspects of that piece of the world we now talk to each other on. Because your space, cyberspace, is now being used to spread disinformation and other malicious acts. Ultimately, do you think that the social media companies are going to be able to regulate themselves, or do you think they will have to be regulated? Where do you think this is going? Right now, I don't see any legislation that's setting down rules, but I'm an old television correspondent, and I remember the fairness doctrine quite well, and the effect that it had, some thought positive, later it was thought negative, on television in this country.
I expect that there will be regulation. There has been, and I hope that it can be kind of well-informed and jointly crafted. I see a lot of work on the technical side that does inspire me in terms of being able to spot disinformation, for example, deepfake detectors, being able to identify polarizing language and provide tools for moderators and authors and viewers to help them tackle polarization, and also for countering radicalization, and I've done some work in that space. So, I mean, my field is definitely on the technology side, and I'm excited that there's so much work going on there. But I expect governments and tech sector and advocacy groups and the press, and everyone's going to continue playing a role in shaping the path forward.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Theo. I'm a senior in the Elliott School here, and I'm actually missing my cyber class for this, so I'm very, very thrilled to be here, actually. Something I've noticed...
I'll give you a pass.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Admiral Michelle Howard, I think, will hopefully understand. So what I'd like to ask, and what the conversation has been a lot of, is offensive, and so we've talked about DDoS, malware, and phishing, but what could you all speak to about cyber defense, and what can citizens do, and what can corporations do to have better cyber hygiene, and how can people be better informed?
Well, Dmitri, this is right down your territory here.
Yeah, I would say you have to look at who the threat actor is that's coming after you, and you just mentioned cyber hygiene. Cyber hygiene is important, but I would argue that the government oftentimes makes it too important. When you think about Department of Defense, for example, practicing good cyber hygiene is not going to stop a Russian or Chinese military intelligence agency for breaking in, right? That's not even going to slow them down. So the reality is that when you're facing that type of threat, and it's not for everyone, right? I'm not saying that individual consumer is facing, Russian intelligence threat, unless you're a high-value target, probably not. But if you are, what you need to do is work under the assumption that they're already in, that for an organization of any large size, there'll always be the biggest vulnerability out there that you can never patch, which is the end user, who's going to click on just about anything. In a large enough organization, you'll always find people like that. So you have to assume that they'll get in, and what you need to do is hunt for them on your network, try to identify them as quickly as possible, and eject them before they do any damage. And it's all about speed of action, speed of response. And if you're doing that, you can actually do very well. And we work with companies all the time that are facing attacks on a day-to-day basis and are able to defend against them successfully. That's not everyone, right? So if you're not facing that type of threat, if you're facing a more opportunistic criminal actor, then absolutely your primary focus should be hygiene, patching, better security on your machines, those sorts of things. But you need to look first and foremost who is the threat you're facing and what types of defenses you need to build and deploy to match that threat.
Dmitri, to build on that, the new cyber strategy put out by U.S. Cyber Command, the newly elevated U.S. Cyber Command, talks about a forward defense that sounds a lot like the old world of counterterrorism, of sending the special forces into that house in Pakistan or Afghanistan or something to find the threat before it attacks out. As a practical matter, is that doable, or does that put us on a constant sort of war footing before a country might even attack us?
Well, practically speaking, there's certainly a lot you can do with cyber offense to take down malicious infrastructure that's been used by those threat actors. You broke a story just recently, I think, that the U.S. government may be sending text messages to GRU officers, telling them we know who you are, please stop. So there's a variety of things.
They're very polite text messages, yeah.
I'm sure. But the efficacy of this at scale, I question personally, because when you put yourself in the shoes of a military intelligence officer in Russia, and you're receiving a text message like this, do you think you're going to disobey an order from your general just because you got a text message? Would a U.S. Military person who is executing a mission for their country disobey an order because they get a text message like this, or other things that may be done to them as cyber? I think we need to look much harder at ultimately influencing the regimes that are giving those orders, as opposed to the individual personnel who probably won't have a choice to say no.
Hi, my name's Pratik. I'm a graduate student at GW. My question's for Dmitri. With the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence, primary example being the Google Assistant, where we do not know if you're interacting with a machine or a human anymore. So how do you feel how would the dynamic in cyber war change if hackers or nations were to develop machines that would cause cyber attacks without a trail that's left behind? And would that lead to cyber armies and artificial-powered cyber armies in the world in the future?
I'll answer in a few seconds since we're out of time, but cybersecurity is all about a cat-and-mouse game. It is the one field of technology that we will never solve, quote-unquote solve, because it is all about humans on the other end that are trying to find our weaknesses. Unlike any other area in technology, we're facing a sentient opponent here. And machine learning, artificial intelligence are all tools that will be effective for both defense and offense, but they will not fundamentally change the game.
John, you were saying to me backstage before that when you served in the Bush administration, it was all about counterterrorism. Could you even imagine a question like this about whether or not we were going to be facing essentially artificial intelligence weapons that are making decisions at such a speed that we're having to respond at network speed?
Yeah, no, I mean, not 10, 12 years ago. I mean, when the National Security Division got stood up, it was a response to September 11th and the lack of information sharing and all that. And all the work in those days, there was always a counterintelligence component to it, but really the work was counterterrorism. And today, it's all the issues that we've been talking about today that occupy. We obviously still do counterterrorism, but that takes so much of the time in the discussion.
Take the last question from
Hi, Adrian Papirka. We talked a lot about defense, but not much about offense. The United States never fully claimed Stuxnet. So would it be better for the United States to have a more forceful and owning the cyber offense rather than denying it and seeing what happens and fighting it in the shadows and fighting it in the light?
Who wants to go take this?
I thought in many respects, Dmitri, that you addressed it when you talked about, we do have a lot of policy and legal constraints on our offensive capabilities. I don't know that we may have the world's technical leadership in offensive capabilities, technical capabilities, but we are not going to be the ones who are using these capabilities the most.
And I would say the biggest problem we face, I think, just organizationally and perhaps with legal constraints as well, is thinking about what strategically we want to accomplish and then deciding what tools we want to use for that purpose. Cyber may be a solution to that. It may not be. But oftentimes, I recall Ash Carter, Secretary of Defense in the previous administration, saying in the fight against ISIS, give me my cyber bombs. That was the wrong question to ask, right? The question to ask was, how do we impact ISIS? What tools can we bring to bear? Maybe cyber bombs were appropriate, maybe they were not, but let's not throw the kitchen sink at a problem just because it exists. We need to start with a strategy. What do we want to accomplish? And use the appropriate tools to fulfill that strategy. And oftentimes, because we are so siloed sometimes in different agencies, we tend to go to the solution, the specific solution, without thinking of the strategy.
You know, the last dimension of this as well is if you're going to reach international agreements about what we're going to consider off limits and what we want other countries to consider off limits, election systems, hospitals, power grids, you can't do that without having an open discussion about your capabilities and make a decision within the government about what you're willing to give up. And across administrations that I've covered, I have not seen anybody willing to go do that. Sir, you're going to get the very last question, then we're going to let everybody go get their dinner.
Thank you very much. My name is Tad Miller.
Make it good.
Undergraduate.
No pressure.
Computer science student here. So big fan of your work. So security researchers have shown that our election systems used in the past are vulnerable to attacks and whatnot. What makes you think that this sort of thing, meddling and whatnot, won't happen in this upcoming midterm election and future elections? And what are you doing to ensure that it doesn't happen?
So, I mean, we're aware of those vulnerabilities, and some of them are the result of obviously our federal system, in which really the states have the lead, not the federal government, for our election systems. DHS has been working very hard with them to test their capabilities, test the systems themselves, patch the systems, move to paper ballot backup systems in states that don't have that. I mean, some of this is about resiliency, right? So it's if you do get hacked, 1, do you know you've been hacked? 2, do you know how you've been hacked? And 3, how do you sort of undo the effects of the hack? And that's what paper ballot backup basically is about, but also the ability to see that you've been hacked in the first instance. So, there's no system that's going to be 100% effective, but the focus for sure on the DHS side of the house and the FBI side of the house is working with the states to ensure the integrity of the voter registration systems as well as the balloting systems themselves.
And Yasmin, on your end of this, are we moving quickly enough to a system where Facebook or Google or any of the others will be able to identify a social media document, ad, Twitter account, and say, we realize this is designed to make it look like it came from your neighbor down the street, but it was actually written in St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida?
I hope so. I think that while we've done really well with detection, I think it's really impressive, the progress that's been made. It's still retroactive. You know, we haven't yet figured out how to do this in real time. I'm optimistic that that's possible only because so much of cybersecurity is about dynamically identifying organic and inorganic behavior, but it's not imminent.
Can I just add that for the students in the room, I hope if there was one thing that you took away from this discussion, is that if you decide to pursue cybersecurity as a career choice, you'll have job security for life. And companies on this panel, including the government, are hiring, and we need you.
That's right.
Well, I want to thank John, I want to thank Yasmin, thank Dmitri, and all of you for participating. We covered a lot of territory in the course of an hour, and I thank you very much for spending the night. We'll all be watching over the next week to see how this all plays out and far beyond that. Thank you.